Hi, I'm Selina from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Meg Smith, who is a horror writer, but she's also a poet. And you write horror poetry as well. Am I correct?
Yes, I do.
And she has written several several books of poetry, and she's going to talk to us about her latest book, which is not a book of poetry, is it?
No, it's a book of my short stories, The Plague Confessor. So I came prepared.
Great. And I guess for readers unfamiliar with your work, what would you describe? How would you describe what you write?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And as you mentioned, I do write poetry. I write quite a lot of poetry. And I also write short fiction. And I do write a lot in the horror and speculative genres. And I like psychological horror. I like so-called body horror, which, as the name suggests, is kind of in the physical medium of what actually happens to people physiologically in usual situations. And but I also like to write about relationships that people have with one another and the conflicts and the discoveries therein. I'm a first generation Irish American. My mother is from Ireland, and so my culture is something that I'm very proud of, and I think informs a lot of my work as well. And I do quite a bit of traveling when I can. So I think my traveling influences my writing. I consider traveling a privilege to be able to do. And I'm also very much inspired by my community here in Lowell, Mass. So I feel sort of blessed with you could say a kaleidoscope of influences.
Excellent. And what can readers expect from your newest book?
Okay. Well, my newest book, as you mentioned, is The Plague Confessor. And this is a collection of short fiction. It is primarily horror and speculative fiction. And there's also a little bit of historical fiction in there. These are stories that have their origins in different places. They're also, many of them published in different places over about the past 25 years or so. And so the stories are very much influenced certainly by my life experience as a Gen Xer. There are stories about the supernatural. There are stories about nature and crime, and the influence of sort of catastrophic historical events, the medieval plague being one, the Bosnian War being another. And so I really tried to, I feel as if I've been on quite a journey with my stories, and I really try to be true to taking the reader on those journeys as well.
What do you think draws readers to these kinds of stories?
Well, I think that's probably different for everyone. I know for me, ever since I was a child, reading has been kind of an adventure. I think there's a tendency maybe to think of reading as a passive experience, because you can, pretty much sit down or, be lying in bed and reading. But I really think of it as a kind of a dialogue between the reader and the writer. And it's like you're going somewhere together and on some kind of journey. And it might be a funny journey. It might be sad. It might be scary. It might be a little bit hard to quantify. And as the writer, I feel like the obligation is really in the writer's lap to create that experience. It's like the writer's the designated driver on this cool journey.
Mm-hmm. What was the inspiration for some of your stories? Like you had mentioned the Bosnian War, and you had mentioned the plague.
Right. So the Plague Confessor, the title story in that was inspired by, and I should mention, of course, we're in the middle of a terrible pandemic right now. This story was actually written about 2 years prior to that. Although when I look at it now, I certainly feel quite a very personal resonance. That story was, I've been always interested in epidemiology. I come from a public health family. Both my parents were in the nursing and public health professions. My late husband worked in public health. So, the story, The Plague Confessor, is kind of a story about the social impact of the plague, and it revolves around a true life thing that happened when the sort of Catholic majority community in Europe began to run out of clergy to actually give last rites, to actually say prayers, which was, and I would say still is, an important part of Catholic tradition. Well, those clergy started to get sick and die. And the Pope sent out an edict basically saying, look, you can confess your sins to one another. You can confess your sins to your friend. And at this point, you can even confess them to a woman. At that time, women were not members of the clergy, although they were prominent in Catholicism and other ways. So I created this hypothetical situation where I thought, well, what women are walking around in the public square at this point in time? And it would be basically people who had no choice but to go out. So the story, The Plague Confessor, actually turns on a woman who is a streetwalker, a prostitute. And she's about one of the only people sort of left who's alive and well, who can go and hear people's confessions. And she takes on that role. So that's kind of, in essence, the story of The Plague Confessor.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there was a lot of research that you had to do. So what kind of research went into writing this book?
So for the story of The Plague Confessor itself, I have to say, certainly I've had the ability to travel to Europe, to Ireland, to England, to Germany specifically, and be able to sort of walk the lands where the hand of the plague was, and other disasters were felt very deeply and personally. And also, quite honestly, I'm someone who does a lot of reading, as I mentioned, but I also do a lot of documentary surfing. And it was actually in the course of watching, I think it was a National Geographic document, where the professors were talking about this Pope, I believe it was Pope Clement, who basically said, if you have to, confess your sins to a woman. And it's not that an idea emerged full cloth, but I think later I started to think about it, and I thought that, boy, if I'm going to write a story about the Black Death, that would be a really neat thing for the story to pivot upon.
Wow. What's your favorite research story? And it doesn't have to be about this book, but just in general.
Well, I would say that, quite honestly, a lot of the short stories, that one was definitely heavy on research. And many of the short stories, if I find myself sort of in a place where I'm like, yeah, I need to kind of get down to brass tacks in terms of learning more about what was the time and place, and something to give these characters the ring of truth. But in terms of research, honestly, it can come from anything. It can come, as I mentioned, I've been fortunate to travel many places. And I also have grown up in being Irish American, a wonderful storytelling tradition, both an oral and a written tradition. And having, I guess, lived a very rich and varied life experience, I do draw quite a lot from that as well.
Mm-hmm. Were there any cool facts and findings that didn't make it into the book, but you loved discovering?
Well, I think that there were a lot of things to discover. And in terms of the short stories in The Plague Confessor, I think, honestly, any short story, like any poem, is probably a lot of whittling down things. And so maybe being a cat person, probably if I were to look back with some distance on the books, I would probably say, yeah, there might have been a lot more cats in these stories, potentially. There are a few cats, but when you have animals that are a great part of your life, sometimes you have to stop and say, okay, maybe I need to put, in my case, a dog or parrot, or somebody else, some other being in there.
So what was the biggest challenge in writing and putting out your newest book? And how did you overcome that challenge?
Well, that's a really great question. I started putting the Plague Confessor together as I did the other two poetry books that came out last year, before the onset of the pandemic that we are currently in. And I would say that the pandemic, of course, presented and continues to present quite a bit of tragedy for many people, and many other sort of rippling out challenges as well. I think that certainly that also presented for a writer, I think a great sense of, quite honestly, you have a feeling of like, is this really the most important thing I could be doing right now? There's so much need. There's so much urgency in responding. And I am a journalist by profession. I've been a journalist for 30 years. And so I felt perhaps more than perhaps some folks, like, well, having a role where at least you felt like you had some control as well as responsibility to put information out there that people needed and put it out in a timely way. But I think that, but all of us living in that kind of uncertainty, I think that I did kind of have to take some steps back and say, well, I'm alive, and every breath that you take is a privilege and a responsibility. And I'm in a position that, quite honestly, many people no longer are. And that is that I have something that I love to do, and I can continue to do it. And that's it was not the first time that I said that to myself, certainly not the first national or international crisis that we have found ourselves in. But I did find that did kind of push me forward to say, time is a fragile thing. Life is a fragile thing. If you have a chance to do something that means something to you, that's important to you, then now is certainly the time.
Mm-hmm. And what character did you love or hate the most when you were writing, and why?
Well, among the short stories that are in here is a story going back to 1993 that I written. And without giving too much of it away, there's a character in it who on the surface, and by the way, the protagonist of the story basically is going out from a sort of a job in a high-tech cubicle farm, because it was written in the midst of the dot-com boom. And is going on a foliage exploring weekend up in New Hampshire, not too far from where we are. And the character, I think, does not, and I purposely created a character that was not unlikable, but sort of little unlikable traits about this individual start to surface. And he starts out basically as kind of just a hard-working guy who's knocking off for a long weekend of leaf peeping and maybe getting away from the pressures of urban life. And the further he goes along, the more things become apparent about him, and bringing to what I hope is kind of a strong and disturbing climax. That's certainly the inference I got from the editor who published the story. So he's not a character that I like personally, but sometimes that kind of character can be sort of fun and challenging to develop.
Right, yes. And what can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, I have, as I think probably many of my peers in the writing world, probably many stories that could be compiled into a new book, many poems that certainly could. And I think that's something that I would like to work on in a timely way. I'd like very much to put out another short fiction collection, another poetry collection. And I've been working on a novel that I kind of take my cue from Ray Bradbury in this sense, where The Martian Chronicles, one of my favorite books, starts out as a collection of separate short stories. And I have a number of short stories that I would like to assemble with some changes of continuity into a novel. and get it done already.
I was going to ask if you definitely, it sounds like you definitely prefer short stories to novels, to writing.
Well, I think, yeah, well, you know, when I was a kid, of course, sometimes you think when you're a kid, you're in a different life circumstance. I wrote novels, what I characterize as novels, quite a lot. And I would just kind of sit down and write them. And when I think about it, I think that's not a bad thing for writers to take, to look back on their 10-year-old self, 12-year-old self, and say, well, that person just sat down and didn't have a lot of preconceptions about how to do things, and they just did it. And honestly, I think that I often bring that 10-year-old self with me many times when I sit down, and not just for writing.
That kind of leads me into the next section, which is about you being a writer. What's your favorite part of being a writer on the whole writing and publishing process?
I think my favorite part of being a writer is that writing to me is like a kind of magic. And it's a kind of magic that really is within just anybody's grasp. Anyone really who can read and write has access to that magic. And I feel like it's also a kind of responsibility, because words and writing are a tool and an art medium that we can fashion into something great. And it can take on many different kinds of powers. It can simply entertain people, which I think is a perfectly okay thing for a story or a piece of writing to do. It can take people into an alternate reality. It can take people to find something about themselves. And as a journalist, of course, which is a different kind of writing, but there's a tremendous responsibility there. But I think also a kind of magic. And I think that that's the power to tell stories to people, to understand something about themselves and each other and their neighbors, and maybe give them the tools through facts and through reading about someone else's experience to maybe come together and build something stronger together in their community.
What do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process, and how do you overcome that?
Sometimes, as I think a lot of writers will probably agree, sometimes the challenging part is simply beginning. There can be many times where I think a writer, myself included, sits down either with a notebook or a tiny notebook, you know, on a public bench or something, or at a laptop, and just say, "Oh, I got nothing." I know lots and lots of words, not lacking vocabulary, but I got nothing. And then sometimes then you have to decide, all right, well, am I going to just put this down and go do something else until I get something? Or am I gonna push this a little further and perhaps find that, yeah, there's a something. It's just that I've got to work a little harder at drawing it out, or bringing it into being, or reconciling myself to it, or listening to it, which sometimes I think is maybe sometimes the most important thing, is listening to it.
Mm-hmm. And what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Wow, I've had so many. I would say, gosh, there's so many. One of them most certainly I would say was the meeting of my late husband, Lawrence Carradini, who was a scientist, as I mentioned, and a poet. We met through the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Festival. For those who don't know, the writer Jack Kerouac was actually born and raised here in Lowell, Mass. And he wrote quite a few books about Lowell, Mass, inspired by his Franco-American Catholic working class upbringing here. And it was through the process of becoming an event organizer in the festival that I met my husband, and we went on what we like to call Meg and Larry's excellent adventure. That took us many places all over the world, and as well as just sitting down watching movies sometimes. But we went many, many places together, and that was a truly excellent adventure of 18 years in my life.
So what is the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
probably the greatest lesson is something that I really tried to take to heart, even going way back to when I was a little kid. And that is that you can really do anything if you're committed to it. And speaking as a woman, I grew up, of course, in a time when I think one of the biggest social debates that was going on in our popular culture and our national discourse was this idea of whether women should work outside the home, which quite honestly, that was a totally alien discussion. That was never a discussion that took place in our home because my mother always worked. She was a nurse. She came to this country as a nurse. And in fact, I knew very few, as a kid growing up, I knew very few kids whose moms were at home full time. There simply wasn't that debate. And it seemed like, and not that there wasn't validity to the debate, but I sometimes feel that now that debate was happening in different worlds within our society, but it was not happening in ours. And so that partly led to the reality that, yes, if one has financial needs, one goes to work regardless of gender. Saying my mom worked, all of the adult women around me worked. So that it never, one consequence of that is that it never enters into your mind that you can't do something simply based on being a girl. And it just doesn't enter your mind because it doesn't enter your reality. And I remember just from a very young age, I have a very primal memory of just writing and drawing and scribbling and doing crossword puzzles, whatever, just from a really young age, and never ever having like second guessing. Oh, can I do this? Am I supposed to do this? Am I supposed to eventually earn my own income or have a career? That just never happened. And I do think that laid a certain groundwork of like living in worlds of possibility, and then reading books and looking at books on a shelf, and of course now we have them in the digital sphere, but saying, yeah, that can be my book someday. I just have to do it.
So what piece of advice would you want to share with other writers?
Well, I always feel like, as a writer, I would never, on the one hand, would never really have the presumption to tell other writers what they need to do. I can only speak from my experience, which is to say, I would say one thing very honestly: writing is a very difficult career and it's a very difficult way of life. And a writer may have a great deal of sensitivity, and I think sensitivity is sometimes a virtue that's not well valued in this society. But nevertheless, a person can have sensitivity and empathy and creativity, and still needs to reconcile with the fact that even very, very well-known writers, Stephen King among them, still get rejections sometimes. And it's not a reflection on the writer's work. It's simply that, quite honestly, there are many people who want to be writers, who are writers, and want to live comfortably financially as a consequence of their writing. So that's a very important fact to recognize, and to be able to say to yourself, well, I'm going to accept the disappointments, the hardships, the setbacks that might come with it, and still just say, well, I'm still going to do this. So I would say, I've always considered myself a writer. I'm not interested in comparing myself, success-wise or anything else to other writers. I am basically on my own path, and I think all writers are on their own paths. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no real race except the race that one sets a course for. It's certainly not a race against other writers. It's simply, I'm also a Middle Eastern dancer, and a famous Middle Eastern dancer once said, you just competing against yourself. And Middle Eastern dance is also a competitive sphere, but I always took that idea to heart there as well as the writer. And really, I think anything that's of value, if we're competing against ourselves, that's the way to run the race.
I think that's great advice. Just compare yourself. Great advice. Are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you'd recommend to other writers that might have helped you in your career?
Sure. Well, I think a lot depends on the type of writing that that a person likes to do or is drawn to. I would say certainly in terms of genre writing, the Horror Writers Association is one that a lot of people find is a great resource. There's also a Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association for people who are interested in writing poetry in those genres. And of course, also in the age of social media, there are many different kinds of groups and pages and things like that. And sometimes you can just connect just with other people of a kindred spirit informally that way. That, I guess that's another magical tool that we have nowadays.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. Now I have some questions about you as a person.
Sure.
What's one thing that most people don't realize about you?
One thing that most people don't realize about me, I would say that it might be perhaps the fact that I have a great, and maybe some people who know me very well realize this, but I have a great affinity for what are sometimes known as the lowered order form of animals. And these are basically in the way that animals are categorized and classified, creatures who are sort of in invertebrates, and even before them, reptiles and fish are, I think, and this may be sort of an arcane term, but they're kind of viewed as the lower ordered form of animals. It's not a reflection on them and their talents, but quite honestly, insects, spiders, arthropods, arachnids, as a little girl. And one thing I will say about the time that when I grew up, one thing that's not as true now, even though it was a time when girls were really getting their bearings to do all kinds of things, liking those creatures was really not a thing that was kind of sanctioned. And I really give so much credit to my parents because, first of all, they nurtured a love of the sciences and a love of curiosity and a love of animals, and even bought me all kinds of books about snakes and alligators and all of these things. So I would say perhaps that's not something a person might look at me and immediately know or recognize, but yeah, I put that out there now to the world.
You should definitely go to Mass Audubon sanctuaries.
and I do, absolutely. And when I have the occasion to write about creatures, I take great pride in being one of the first journalists in our area to write about turtles and the plight of turtles crossing the road in the springtime. And that my writing actually got a culvert unblocked on Route 2 here in central Massachusetts in the vicinity of the Oxbow National Wildlife Refuge, thereby allowing the snapping turtles to get across. And writing is a way to empower people, to empower creatures. That's something that I will always be very proud of.
Must be a big night, right? Yes. Great. What question do you wish interviewers would ask you, and what would your answer be?
Well, I think that certainly as someone who does a lot of interviews myself as a journalist, I definitely always step back and think about what, are we asking the right questions here, that, the questions that really matter. And I've been fortunate because including yourself, I've had the occasion to do interviews with people who've asked really great questions, and sometimes really unexpected questions. And I've always sort of felt that their respect for writing and their respect for the art of writing really shines through. I would say that, quite honestly, so many of the questions I've been asked, have really covered a lot of the ground that that writers should cover, and that interviewers should cover. So yeah, I would say that anyone who's giving interviews, just step back and maybe think about put themselves in the writer's chair and say, well, what would make a great conversation? Because I think the art of an interview is the art of a conversation, really.
Okay. What is or are your passions when you're not writing? And how do you make time for the hobbies and things that you love?
Well, caffeine helps. Actually, I've been drinking mostly tea these days, Irish tea. That's actually a great question because I do have a lot of passions. As I mentioned, I'm a Middle Eastern dancer. That's also something that I fell in love with at a really young age. And I've had the privilege of dancing in a lot of different festivals, nightclub venues, community recitals, and also doing a little bit of performing and studying abroad, including in the Middle East. Wow. And I love to sing. I sang in a rock band for a time. And in fact, I met my wonderful current husband, Derek Savoya, singing karaoke. And that's something that we really love to do together still when we can. Of course, now the pandemic has changed that a lot. I love to cook, and quite honestly, that is a passion that came to me a little bit later in life. I was not someone who was super in love with cooking before, but in the last couple of years, and especially the last few years of my late husband's life, when I was trying to do something that we could enjoy together, I really started to get excited about that. I have a passion for sewing, which is another passion that came to me later in life. And I like to now sew my own dance costumes, and actually making some cat and dog toys for a student who's doing a collection drive for the 2 local animal shelters. So I'm trying to help her out with some hand sewn toys. I love my garden here at my house. I'm not the most talented gardener, but I do have a lot of love as a plant mom, and I do my best. I love the visual arts. I did a lot of drawing when I was younger, and I've somewhat gotten away from that, but I still love and appreciate it. And gosh, I love the sciences. I have a deep and abiding respect for science, and feel passionate about it as a great tool for solving problems and solving inequities. I'm passionate about language. I speak Spanish quite well, and another couple of languages in a sort of perfunctory way. I think my Arabic is pretty good. I don't know what the cab drivers in Cairo would say about it, but we have fun, with the attempt. So I feel blessed because I feel like I have many passions in my life, and blessed in the opportunity to live them and explore
That's
them.
wonderful. And what are some of your writing related hobbies or crafts or addictions?
Well, when I was a really young kid, one thing I liked to do was like crossword puzzles. And now as an adult, crossword puzzles are one of those kind of things where you sometimes feel like, well, if I had the time, would I really be devoting it to doing that? Or should I be doing some more writing or something like that? But I do still love them. And I've tried to sort of build a bridge between writing and some of the other things I love to do. I have produced a number of events that have brought literature and dance together, including a series of events devoted to Edgar Allan Poe, who spent some time here in Lowell, Mass. And I also, my love of travel, I tried to bring into my books as well. And some of my stories are very local and intimate in their setting, and others are take folks hopefully far and wide, as I've had a chance to do.
Mm-hmm. And what does your writing space look like? And what do you need to have around you when you're writing or editing?
Well, my great friend, the poet and researcher Paul Marion, one time said that he was talking, I think, specifically about poetry, but the poetry travels light. And I would say writing as a whole travels right. And he was absolutely correct about it. And these days, where we have laptops and things like that, we can go almost anywhere. Right now, I do, quite honestly, quite a lot of writing in our den. I do a lot of writing sometimes just on the couch or even at the dining room table. I have an office that's a little bit under construction right now. So I'm a little bit of a nomadic writer. As far as things to have around me, I like to have something to drink because I think it's important to stay hydrated. And writing is one of those activities that a person can get so lost in that it's easy to overlook sort of just basic self-care things like that. I think having some quiet is ideal, but I live in an urban neighborhood, so I accept the fact that there's a lot of ambient sound. And mostly, I think just the most crucial element is probably just the time. And sometimes as writers, we have to fight for that time.
So I gather that you do prefer silence rather than music, or?
Sometimes I have music on, and sometimes I put the music on, and then after a while, I'm not hearing the music anymore because I'm writing. But I have certainly over the years, as a writer who's traveled a lot, who's lived different places, and certainly as a journalist who's used to dealing with a lot of sort of unplanned events in the world, I've learned, I think, probably not to be too fussy, as long as, I guess, to allude to Hemingway, it's a clean, well-lighted place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And writers very often, and it sounds like you might, okay, they have either furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions.
Sure.
Who either help or hinder them through their work. And do you have any, and how do they help or hinder you?
Sure. Well, right now we have 3 cats. We had Snickers, who's all black, and we recently adopted 2 other cats. One is a tabby cat named Kirby, and the other is a sort of a tortie tiger. Her name is Keely. And yes, to your point, I think a lot of writers do seem to like to have familiars or kind of spirit creatures around them. And I'm not always sure why that is, but I think that maybe it's because writers like to experience something in someone else's skin. And I think writers are connected to creatures across the lines of species. Sometimes I think speciation isn't as much an arbitrary boundary for some folks. In terms of helping, I think they absolutely help just in terms of providing that friendship, that affinity, that kindredness, certainly inspiration. I do have quite a number of cat-inspired poems, and cats and other creatures, other animals have also made their way into my short stories. I think hindrance might be, certainly in terms of cats, anyone who has a cat knows what I mean. In terms of speciation boundaries, cats are not interested in any boundaries. They'll just, come up in your lap when they want your attention and walk across the keyboard and create some interesting hieroglyphic language. If not, accidentally contacting someone at the research base in Antarctica by accident. And so I think that the other sort of side of that hindrance, though, is that when you're living with, just as with another person, when you're living with another being, any being, you've made a pact with that being, and that is that you love each other and you are making time for the care and love of that creature. And it's not even like any real relationship. It's not a 50-50 thing. It's 100-100 thing.
Yes, I agree with that. How important has the New England setting been to your work?
Wow. New England is, at least, to me, I mean, I think a good writer could come from anywhere and certainly be brought up anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world, as we've seen. But growing up in New England, for me as a writer, is just so cool because it is like such a potent mix of so many elements. As I mentioned, I'm first generation Irish American. My father also came from the Irish enclave of Charlestown in Boston. And so in New England, I always think, well, what do you have? New England is not to make too much of a pun, but is an amazing crucible of things. I come from a people who spoke a language other than English, are Catholic, are pre-Christian pagan, are bringing all those things to bear. And there are many other immigrant groups bringing their own stories. We have a very powerful indigenous heritage also. And in the midst of that, we have a New England, what was basically handed down to us from the Puritan settlers, who created this whole other map. And all these things are here together. And so to me, I feel like I know my heritage and I know my ethnicity, and yet I know that I am also touched by all these other amazing influences. New England also has, of course, an amazing sort of Gothic heritage of Gothic storytelling. Some of our greatest Gothic writers come from here. We have a very powerful historical map of events, some of them quite tragic. And it's just a very beautiful and varied landscape, and beautiful and varied seasons. So I think, as I said, a good writer can come from anywhere, but I do feel blessed to live here, to have been brought up here, and to live in the magical city of Lowell, where I live now.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. And I just have two more questions for you. One, where can people find your work besides Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And here I'm going to actually give us a little bit of a plug.
Absolutely.
And basically, you can order any books at Annie's Bookstop of Worcester. And you can call us at 508-796-5613. And you can also email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. So if you would like any of Meg's books, you can do that. And basically, where else could people find your work?
Sure. Well, I have a website that has an online store where all my books are available. That's megsmithwriter.com. And in fact, my 5 titles from Emu Books are on there. And I will say that anyone who orders all 5 gets a tremendous break on shipping. And so that's on there, and very easy one-stop ordering and shopping. And those who order from there, I'd be more than glad to and honored to to sign those books if desired. All of my titles from Emu Books are also available on Amazon. And I have a Facebook page, facebook.com/MegSmithWriter. And I'm also on Twitter at Meg_Smith_writer. So you can reach out to me at all of those places and let me know what books you're interested in. And I'd be glad to sign them and send them out.
Great, thank you. That was actually the 2 questions that I had for you.
And actually, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are also several of my books are honestly in quite a few different stores around the area, but also at the Lovecraft Arts and Sciences Council, which is in Rhode Island, and a great, certainly a fantastic resource for writers and horror writers in particular in this area, Lovecraft being a Rhode Island native. And so I wanted to just give a shout out because I have some books down there as well.
Great.
And yeah, because we know, to your point, our brick and mortar friends, I urge everyone to support them and efforts like yourselves. And especially right now, if we can all pull together and support each other, I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely. Right. Well, thank you so much, Meg. And hopefully when the pandemic is over, we can have you in person at our store.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And hopefully we will be seeing you soon.
All right.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. And thanks for everybody watching and listening. And please take care, stay safe and healthy in your travels.